Well, hey, everybody, welcome to North Shore. So good to see you. I'm so glad that you're with us this weekend, whether it's your first time here, or maybe your first time in a while. And for those of you joining us online, so glad that you're tuning in wherever you're watching from. And by the way, if you're in the Kirkland area, you still have time to get out of those pajamas and get over to our campus because Summer Palooza is today, which is super exciting. And yes, it's true. I'm going to be in the dunk tank today, but as your pastor, I need to remind you of those sacred words from Jesus himself who said, let the one who is without sin throw first. Okay? God's watching, so. Hey, as we dive into the message today, I want to start with a story from when I was a kid. When I was growing up, all I wanted to be in life was bigger. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I grew up kind of always small for my age. Remember those signs at the amusement park or the fair, too short to ride? Like those applied to me until like a couple years ago, right? Growing up on the smaller side, it had its challenges in life. When I was learning to play sports, the other kids were always, bigger and stronger and faster. When I was in middle school, I often kind of got pushed around by bigger kids who like to bully smaller kids. When I was in high school, I actually made the varsity basketball team, but I never played in any games. I was too short to actually get in the game. So the taller kids played while I sat on the bench and developed character. And through all those years, I remember thinking to myself, if only I was a little bigger, if only I was a little bit taller, if only I was a little bit stronger, then I'd have more friends, then I'd be more successful at sports, then I'd feel more attractive. And then finally, I got a little bit bigger, I got a little bit taller, not too much taller, but I got a little bit taller. And you know what happened? Those fears didn't go away. The insecurity in me didn't go away. The self-doubt that I wrestled with didn't go away. It's kind of like when you get into that school or you get that dream job and you think the self-doubt inside is just gonna magically disappear, but it doesn't. Or when you get married or you start dating someone and you believe, you're just so convinced, the loneliness or the emptiness inside, it's just gonna go away, but then it doesn't. Or when you finally reach that level of financial security, you've got that great job, things are all kind of lined up, and you think your fears about your life or the future, they're just gonna go away, but then they don't. You see, when it comes to dealing with fear and anxiety in life, our strategy, it's kind of a universal human thing. Our strategy is how can I make my life bigger or stronger or greater? If I just become rich enough or attractive enough or popular enough or successful enough, then I won't be afraid, right? Just think for a moment about the biggest fear, the biggest worry in your life right now. Maybe your biggest worry is about a loved one in your life, or losing a loved one in your life. Maybe your biggest fear is about being criticized or being rejected by someone. Maybe your biggest fear is around money or having enough or having security for your future. Or maybe it's something else. I actually read an article this past week that said the number one fear in America is what I'm doing right now, public speaking, right? Some people say they fear public speaking more than death itself. Isn't that interesting? It's like hard for me to believe. That means some people would rather die than give a sermon. I know people who'd rather die than hear a sermon. Some of you are thinking that right now, but it's a kind of a remarkable thing. We all wrestle with fear or worry in some way or another. And sometimes those fears, for whatever reason, can seem so big, so overwhelming, so scary, so powerful. But maybe, and that's what we're gonna be talking about today, maybe your fears aren't too big. Maybe your God is actually too small. Maybe what's actually happening in your life, again, we're gonna dive into this together. Maybe your fears aren't too big. Maybe what's happening, maybe your God is too small. Whoever you believe God to be, maybe your God is too small. You see, if your God is too small, you're gonna constantly worry about the future because your God isn't big enough to protect it. If your God is too small, you're gonna be tempted to strive for wealth or status or achievement because your God isn't big enough to satisfy you. If your God is too small, you'll be easily discouraged by criticism or rejection or disappointment because your God isn't big enough to support you or define you. You see, whether you follow Jesus or not. And if you don't follow Jesus, we're so glad that you're here. I'm so glad that you're here taking a risk to be at church this weekend or to watch online. But whether you follow Jesus or not, how you live your life is a reflection of how big your God is. However you're living is actually a mirror, it's a reflection, it's a picture of how big you believe God to be. And that means overcoming your fears, overcoming your worries, overcoming fear in life isn't about having a bigger or stronger or greater life. It's about trusting a bigger and stronger and greater God. And I hope I can convince you to do that today. Now, if you were here last week, we started this new series called Less Fear, More Courage. And we're looking at some stories in the Bible of men and women who had to kind of face their fears and live with courage. And we've been diving into these kind of three old books of the Bible, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And if you were here last week, we talked through the story of this man named Joshua, his taking the reins in his life and taking responsibility for his life and the courage he lived in that one. And then next week, we're going to look at the remarkable story of this woman, Ruth. It's going to be an incredible weekend. You're not going to want to miss it. But between those two books, there's a collection of stories, very unique stories in this book called Judges. Now, just so you know, judges in the Bible are not the same thing exactly as judges in our day. They were more like tribal leaders who protected God's people and led them through battles and were on guard against foreign invasion. And there's actually 12 judges in the book of Judges that you can read about. Some of these names are going to look kind of strange, not familiar, but some of these names you know, or you might know, like Samson. You know, strong, athletic, great hair, terrible at relationships, kind of like someone you dated in high school, right? Everyone has a Samson name in their life. Or maybe you've heard the name Deborah, the woman who was leading all of Israel. And yes, women lead in the Bible, even over men, that happens. But what's true about all of these judges, whether you know their stories or not, is they all came into leadership in some kind of a crisis in Israel. In fact, one of the most common phrases that you see in the book of Judges over and over is, and the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Like over and over, they fell into idolatry. Or they began to worship other gods. Or they took on the practices of the Canaanite culture. That happened over and over again. And God would then allow some foreign nation to invade Israel as kind of a wake-up call. And then the Israelites would cry out to God for help. They would cry out for help, and God would then raise up a leader or a judge who would deliver them back into a season of peace, which would last only until they were unfaithful again. And the cycle continued and continued over and over and over, which brings us to our story, Judges chapter 6, verse 1. You can follow along. No surprise how the story begins. The Israelites, once again, did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years, he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Now, who are they? What's the context here? Well, Midian or the Midianites was a group of nomadic tribes, nomadic people that lived in what's now the Arabian Peninsula. And at times, they would travel north to Israel and invade Israel, and they would basically steal their crops and their livestock. And they were so numerous and they were so hostile that Israel would actually retreat and live in caves. I mean, they were hiding in fear. In fact, the text says that Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Again, it's part of the cycle, right? We've seen this over and over in the book of Judges. That's not a surprise. What's a surprise is the person who God picks to be that leader, who he chooses. Let's look at what happens. Verse 11 says, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak of Ophrah, not Oprah, Ophrah, that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon, this is going to be our person, Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press to keep it from the Midianites. Now, we need to pause because I want you to understand what's happening in this scene. Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press. Now, for those of you who thresh wheat for a living, you know that doesn't happen in a wine press. It happens in this large open space called a threshing floor. In the ancient world, that might look something like this, kind of a large, kind of open space where workers or farmers would take straw and they would use tools to beat the straw or beat the grain just to loosen the grain from it. So that's threshing wheat. And you would expect Gideon to be threshing wheat on a threshing floor. In fact, later in the story, we're going to find out he has a threshing floor, but he's not on it. Nope, our guy Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press, which in the ancient world looked something like this, a hole in the ground where they would kind of get in, crouch down, and tread on grapes basically to make wine. But here's the thing, you can't really thresh wheat in a wine press. I mean, you got to crouch down. It's ineffective. You're kind of not able to do it. You can't hold much wheat. It's not efficient. Sort of like in our day, it'd be like trying to mow your lawn with a beard trimmer, okay? It would take forever. It wouldn't really work out. Your neighbors would be like, what are you doing? What's happening over there? So why is Gideon threshing wheat down in a wine press? Because he's afraid. He's terrified. He's insecure. He doesn't want the Midians to come and take his little bit of wheat, so he's hiding, which is when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And I kind of think Gideon would laugh because he's like, mighty warrior, me? I mean, I think you've got the wrong address. I think you got the wrong guy. I think you need to look somewhere else because Gideon's not a mighty warrior. Warrior. He's more like a terrified thresher. He's hiding in a hole in the ground. But here's the deal. God chooses him anyway. He chooses him anyway. You see, your fear, your worry does not disqualify you from God choosing you. In fact, God often comes and calls and chooses people who are afraid. And notice, God doesn't just call him out when he's afraid. He calls him by a name that calls him out of his fear. Mighty warrior. Because, and this is really important, we become like what we're called. Just like all the labels and names you may have been called in your past that still live in your heart, your soul somewhere, you're still trying to work out the shame or the guilt or the disappointment or the insecurity from those other labels. God comes and he calls you out by a different name, a name that gives you courage. A name that gives you courage. He looks out into this room, he looks at you watching online and says, I see a strong leader. I see a smart student. I see a confident parent. I see a faithful spouse. By the way, whose voice are you really listening to when you're afraid? Yours? Somebody else's you know? Or the God who made you and who knows you and who sees what he can be and do in you and through you? Well, it's that God who comes to Gideon when he's hiding down in a wine press and says, guess what, Gideon? You're my guy. I'm choosing you out of everybody else, everybody who's stronger, everybody who's greater, everybody who has more influence. Nope, I don't want them. I want you. You're my guy, mighty warrior. But as you might expect, not only is this a shock to Gideon, but he's still living in his fear. And by the way, courage doesn't always happen just overnight. So Gideon objects. He's not having it. Pardon me, my Lord, he replied, but if the Lord is with us. Now pause real quick. What did God say? God said that I'm with you, Gideon. But Gideon, he can't even fathom that God would call him. He can't even believe it would be about him. So he changes the pronouns up. If the Lord is with us, us as a group, not me, but us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. You see, when your God is too small, you begin to believe that things can't change, right? That problem in that marriage, it's not gonna change. That job, it's not gonna change. The problem in your life, it's not gonna change. It's just the way it is, we say, right? Or it's just the way I am, we say, right? That's where Gideon is. And again, it's a picture, a reflection of just how small God has gotten in his life. Things are never gonna change. There's no real hope here. Why even bother me? I need to keep threshing my wheat in my little wine press, God. But the good news is Gideon's lack of faith doesn't stop God. So the Lord turned back to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? He reverses the pronoun right back on you, Gideon. And I love this phrase, in the strength you have. Not in the strength of somebody else, not in the strength of that neighbor you know, or that friend you know, or that person who's really strong and really courageous and really holy and has their life together, not in their strength. You go in the strength you have. See, there's no strength prerequisite here. He just says, go with what you got. And for Gideon, by the way, it's not very much. But that doesn't stop God. It's enough for him. But good old Gideon, oh my goodness, I love this guy. He objects again. Check this out. He says, pardon me, my Lord. Notice how polite he is. You know, when you're gonna say no to God, you might as well be polite, right? Like, God, I'm sorry, pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. See, when Gideon looks at his life, all he can see are his limitations. That's all I can see. All the lists of why he can't be the guy. Ever do that? Ever have a moment where all you see is why you can't be the guy? And then it becomes a list of reasons. I might call them excuses because that's what they are in my life, but maybe for you, you call them reasons why you can just go ahead and say no to God, no to the adventures he has for you. God, I can't save Israel. My clan is the weakest. God, I can't serve in my church. I'm just way too busy. God, I can't really share my faith. I don't have all the answers. I wouldn't know how to have that conversation. God, I can't give any money away. I mean, I'm barely getting by month to month as it is. But here's the thing. Your limitations don't actually limit God. In fact, sometimes we have this false sense of humility, like, oh, it could never be me. God could never call me. I don't have what it takes. But in my life, I don't know about you, in my life, that's not humility. It's just being self-absorbed. It's just seeing only what I lack, only my limitations instead of what God could do through me. But your limitations don't limit God. And that's kind of what God goes and says to Gideon. Look at what he says. He said, the Lord answered, says, I will be with you. Like that's gonna be enough. Like that's all you're gonna need. I will be with you, and therefore you will strike down all the Midianites, not some of them, not a few of them, not even most of them, all of them, leaving none alive. In other words, God is all you need on your resume. In other words, it's not about your strength, it's about his. It's not about your courage, it's about his. Kind of goofy illustration of this. How many of you remember the old Disney movie, The Lion King? Anybody? Not like the new one with the animals talking, that's kind of weird, but like the old school, like classic Lion King, right? Well, there's this scene when Simba is like a little cub and he wanders off to a place where he's not supposed to be and he gets cornered by this group of hyenas. And so he lets out the biggest roar he can, which sounds a lot more like a little kitten than a lion. And the hyenas, you remember the part, they just start laughing at him, right? They're like, is that all you got? You know, do it again. We want to hear that again. And so he lets out a roar one more time, but this time you hear this loud, earth-shaking roar. Remember who it was? It was the roar of his father, who was there at his back to save him. And that roar left no doubt who was actually in charge. And friends, that's exactly what life with God is like. When your roar is not loud enough, he will roar for you. When your strength isn't strong enough, he'll be strong for you. And therefore, having courage in this life, overcoming fear in this life, it's not about your strength, it's about his. But guess what? And you're gonna love this. It's so relatable. Gideon's so relatable. Guess what? Gideon still doesn't buy it. Like he's still not having it. In fact, after all that God's told him, he's not sure. So you know what he does? He asks God for a sign. Ever ask God for a sign? He asks God for like, just prove yourself. So look at what he says. He says, okay, God, if, it's a big if here, if you will save Israel by my hands as you have promised, look, I'll place a wool fleece on the, hey, guess what? On the threshing floor that's been here the whole time. If there's dew on only the fleece and not and all the ground is dry, then I'll know you will save Israel by my hand, just as you said. Ever have a moment like that with God? Where you're afraid, so you ask for something kind of like a sign. God, if you do this, then I'll go, but it's only because I want you to do the thing I want you to do. Anyone ever do that? I heard a story not long ago about a guy who's driving down the road and he goes by, he sees this bakery and he says, okay, God, if there's a parking lot in front of the bakery, I know it's a sign for me to go in and get a donut, right? Ever done something like that? And on the fifth time around, there's a parking space and he goes in and gets a donut, right? Well, sure enough, right? Sometimes we ask God for a sign out of faith. Sometimes we do. But sometimes we ask God for a sign out of our fear because we don't trust him to take care of us or we don't want to go where he's calling us. Well, Gideon is so afraid, he starts asking God for one sign after another. Some of you know the story. He says, if there's dew on the ground, but not on the fleece, then I'll know you're being truthful with what you're saying. And so God does it. And Gideon's like, that was nice, but let's try this one more time. I'm still not sure. If there's dew on the fleece, but not on the ground, then I'll believe you. And guess what? God does it again. And by the way, there's a principle here that's really important for us. God is patient even when you're afraid. I mean, I think in my life, when I feel fear, I feel like, well, he's gonna run out of patience so quick. I mean, I'm being so afraid and so cowardly and so whatever. God is patient with Gideon over and over and over in this story. It's worth going back. It's 3 chapters long, read through it. He is so patient time and time again. He doesn't ever rebuke Gideon. He just reminds him, you can trust me, you can trust me, you can trust me. And so Gideon finally goes. He finally goes. And if you know the story, he starts to put together this Israelite army that's gonna go up against those strong and numerous Midianites. But he's got a problem. And it's not an abstract or theoretical, conceptual problem. It's a very concrete problem. It's a numbers problem. Any numbers people in the room? You're gonna like this part of the story. He's got a numbers problem. So we're just gonna go through a series of dashboards just so we can keep up with the numbers in the story, okay? So if you like math, you will love this part of the sermon, okay? So we got 135,000 Midianites. Gideon's only able to put together 32,000 Israelites, so he's outnumbered 4-1. So you know what God does? God comes to Gideon. He says, Gideon, you are way outnumbered. It's not gonna work. Let's go get us some more guys, right? Nope, just the opposite. Look at what God does. The Lord said to Gideon, you have what? Too many men. I mean, that's the last thing that's true about the story. You have too many men. Look what he says next. So I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. It's as if God's saying, like, the last thing that we can have happen is for Israel to think, wow, look at us. We did it. We were so strong. We overcame. We were the underdog. So now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So guess what? 22,000 men left, leaving 10,000 behind, which means, let's go back to our dashboard. Midian still at 135,000, right? Israel's down to 10,000 people. So now, if you do the math, Gideon is outnumbered 13-1. And so God says, oh my goodness, that little trick, that didn't work. We're way outnumbered. This is way too hard. We're not gonna make it. Let's go find some more guys, right? Not even close. Look at what happens. But the Lord said to Gideon, you know what? There's still too many men. Get this, take them down to the water and I will thin them out for you there. I mean, the last thing this army needs is more thinning out, right? Let's go thin out some more guys. So Gideon took the men down to the water. Now this is a real kind of unique part of the story. It says, and there the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. So 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got on their knees to drink. Kind of a strange part of the story. Well, just so you know, in that day, dogs were not like prized and precious cute little pets like they are today. In fact, in that day, no one pampered a dog. No one would buy little treats shaped like cookies for a dog. No one dressed up a dog in like a little doggy sweater for the family picture. And by the way, for those of you who do that, please stop. God hates that, okay? Stop. Dogs in that day were considered like dirty and dispensable animals. They weren't appreciated. So you would think God would at least pick the knee drinkers over the dog lappers, right? Wrong again. Check this out. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go home. Let's go back to our dashboard, shall we? Here are the numbers. It says we got 135,000. Midian staying strong. They haven't lost a guy. Israel's down to what? 300. So God, of his own doing, has now outnumbered the Israelites 450-1. And not only that, they've got knee drinkers. We've got all the dog lappers. Like, it's a total mess. Like, the whole thing is in chaos. And here's the deal. God could just keep on going with this. He could just keep going. Let's get rid of all those guys whose names start with the letter J. Let's get rid of all the people who grew up on a farm. Let's just keep thinning it out and thinning it out and thinning it out. You know why? Because do you know how many men God needs to defeat the Midianites? 0. None. God doesn't need a soldier. God doesn't need a weapon. God doesn't need a strategy. because he is big enough. You know, one of the phrases that our daughter Nora is using a lot these days is when I get bigger. Say, Daddy, when I get bigger, I'm gonna drive a car like you. Daddy, when I get bigger, I'm gonna go to work like you. Daddy, when I get bigger, I'm gonna eat donuts in the pantry when no one's looking, just like you, right? Like, when I get bigger, like I'm watching you, when I get bigger. And that's how we think about life. Like, when I get bigger, when I have more money, when I've been more successful, when I'm established, when I've become someone, when I have lots of followers, then I won't be afraid anymore, because we think overcoming fear, it's about the strength of your resume or the health of your portfolio, but it's not. Overcoming fear is about the size of your God. And to prove it, God will often, he will do this. He will lead you into situations where you feel outnumbered, outmatched, and overwhelmed, because here's the thing, God is not trying to grow your wealth or your resume or your power or your popularity. He's trying to grow your faith. He's trying to grow your belief. He's trying to grow your trust. And he wants you to know he's big enough for that decision. He is big enough for that relationship. He is big enough for that problem. He's big enough for that secret. He's big enough for that struggle. He is always big enough. You know, last winter when COVID broke out right here in our backyard, I felt God say to me, Scotty, I want you to lead your church into doing something about this. And I said, how am I gonna do that? I mean, God, you know, I skipped the global pandemics class in seminary, so I don't know exactly what to do next. And God was like, you know what? You have too many people. Let's just empty this room and quarantine your church and see what happens. And you know what happened? Over $250,000 were given to COVID relief. And a whole new facility was built over at Vision House in Kenmore. And food was stacked for months, literally months, on the Woodinville storehouse shelves. And we had our highest numbers at Easter ever in our history, all while this room was empty. Impossible? No, because God is big enough. And when we start to believe that God is big enough, guess what? That victory in your life that seems so impossible becomes inevitable. I mean, that's what it was for Gideon. I mean, if you know the story, it's actually kind of funny. Gideon and those 300 dog lappers go out and they sneak into the Midianite camp at night and they blow trumpets and they smash jars on the ground. True story. Blow trumpets, smash jars. That's not a strategy. That's just silly, okay? Just silliness. But the Midianites, they woke up so confused, they started attacking each other. They run away. The victory that was impossible had become inevitable. It reminds me of these ancient words written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth when he said, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And by the way, that's Gideon, right? From the least in his family to the greatest leader in Israel. From the weakest clan to the mighty warrior. From a hole in the ground to victory over death itself. And by the way, there's another story in the Bible that goes a lot like that, isn't there? Story about a carpenter from Nazareth named Jesus who was put on a cross and buried in a hole in the ground, only to find out God was big enough. You see, when Jesus came walking out of that tomb, it meant nothing is too big for God, not even death. And I know, it's so hard to believe this in a world that's built on political power and social influence and financial clout. It's easy to think you're only as strong as you are, right? You're only as strong as your resume or your relationship status or your investment portfolio or your job title. Like there's a moment like that later in Gideon's story when he's face to face with the last two leaders of the Midianite tribe. It's like the two strongest of the bunch. And even after they've been captured, they're still taunting Gideon. They say, as is the man, so is his strength. In other words, Gideon, you are only as strong as you are. Well, friends, that is the lie. That is the lie. The truth is, you are as strong as the God who is with you. And the God of the Bible needs no army to win a battle and no money to be rich and no applause to be worthy of worship because he is big enough. He's big enough. Quick story, and I'll be done. Almost 5 years ago, someone here in our church was diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer. and was given less than 12 months to live. This was 5 years ago. I mean, talk about big fears. This is like as scary as you get for that couple and for their family. And it's in moments like that, and you've been in moments where you've got the hard news or the big challenge, the overwhelming odds. It's in moments like that that God can seem really small, and you feel like you're on your own. Or God can get really, really big, and you begin to choose every day to trust him with everything that you've got. And this couple started trusting God every day with everything that they've got through the debilitating treatments, the uncertain moments, all those hard days. Well, I'm here to tell you 5 years later that cancer is in full remission. His brain scans are clear. He's jogging every day. He's even learned to play the piano. In fact, this past week, he was at a routine checkup, and the oncologist was so amazed, she said, "I wish we could bottle up whatever you're doing and give it to all my patients." To which his wife said, "Well, you can't put God in a bottle." And no, you certainly cannot. You can't put him in a bottle or a box or a formula or a theory. God is just too big. And guess what? He knows all about the midnights in your life. He does. He knows about the divorce. He knows about the financial struggle. He knows about the secret. He knows about the infidelity. He knows about all those things. And guess what? He is still big enough. He's bigger than your pain. He's bigger than your problems. He's bigger than your past. And when he roars, he leaves no doubt who's really in charge. And so I want to give each of you a chance right now to let him roar back into your life as the God who he is. So if you would just close your eyes, bow your heads for just a moment right now. And we're going to go before this God who is big enough right now. No matter what you're facing, no matter what the odds or the dashboard seems to say, our God is big enough. I'm going to give you a way to trust him right now. And by the way, if you've never placed your trust in Jesus, if you've never made a decision to put your life into his hands, you can do that right now. In fact, you can just say these words: "Jesus, I believe that you're big enough. I believe that you came into this world and gave your life for me on that cross to die for my sins, to make me right with you. And that means you can overcome any problem I'm facing. I believe, Jesus." You can say those words. And by the way, if it's the first time you've ever prayed that prayer, you've ever trusted this big God with your life, with everyone's eyes closed and heads down, I want to challenge you right now. Just hold your hand up for just a moment. Nobody's looking. Online as well. Thank you for that hand. Thank you. God is at work in this place, and he's really, really big, and he's really, really good. And for the rest of us, we can all pray, God, we can start just by confessing, "Jesus, we've made you so small. We put you in the box of our financial constraints or our limitations or our understanding or our education or whatever it may be. So Jesus, break through our self-sufficiency and break through our fears and break through our worries and break through all the ways we say, 'Pardon me, Lord, but no thanks.' And find us and redeem us and remake us and give us courage to take on whatever you're calling us to take on as a mighty warrior, armed not with our strength, but with yours. God, roar back into our life, leaving a roar that leaves no doubt who's really in charge. God, be big enough, just as you are." And everybody who agreed with this prayer said, amen.